All right, everyone, welcome to another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I am your host. This is Tessa Tovar coming at you. I'm so thrilled to be joined by a very special guest today, Zoe Kors. And we are going to discuss one of my favorite topics, something I am so passionate about, interested in, and I just love to talk to people, especially experts like Zoe, about this subject, which is intimacy. The title of the book that we're going to discuss is Radical Intimacy: Cultivate the Deeply Connected Relationships You Desire and Deserve. And Zoe is a sex and intimacy coach. And in this book, she addresses the essential truth that is almost universally missed in discussions of sex and intimacy. We can meet each other only to the extent that we can meet ourselves. How true is that? And so furthermore, just a little bit more about Zoe, and then I will welcome her to the show. Zoe is a sought-after thought leader of intimacy and sexuality. She is the resident sex and intimacy coach at sexual wellness app Corral and the former senior editor of LA Yoga Magazine. In addition to a thriving private practice, Zoe offers her services through Center for Relational Healing, which specializes in the treatment of sex addicts and their partners. As a member of the CRH team, Zoe works with clients to reintroduce healthy sexuality and intimacy after the trauma, I can't talk, of betrayal. Zoe, I just can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I'm really excited. It's my pleasure.
I'm so excited too. When I got this book in the mail, first of all, it's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful cover, and I'm holding it up if you're watching on YouTube. And books are one of my great loves. And every time I get a book, I like to, this is going to sound a little weird maybe, I like to smell it. I like to a tactile, I like to touch it. And there's something about this book for me that just feels like I want to just swim in it.
That was the goal.
Oh, good. Well, you achieved. Congratulations. So, I guess I'm curious. I love to hear origin stories. So I'm curious how you found this work, maybe how the work found you. Tell me a little bit more about your background, if you will.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, well, I had a 10-year sexless marriage in my 20s. And I talk about that in the book. In the first chapter, I talk about that. I loved my husband. In fact, we're super close. We remain very close. And we share a daughter who's now 25. And we raised her, together as co-parents in two different households. So we were able to transition from our marriage to co-parents and really friends. I call him he's older than me, but I call him like my big little brother. Um, but while I was married to him, I really loved him, and he's a beautiful person, like inside and out. I mean, he's like categorically gorgeous man. And somehow I just completely didn't desire him. And that was unusual for me. Like I never really had that problem before. And there was really nobody I could talk about it with. I mean, I did talk to my gynecologist, and she ran, at my request, she ran some blood tests and everything was normal. And I ended up speaking to a therapist who could talk about the actual relationship itself, but not really the nitty gritty of our sex life and that sexual dynamic. And so, we ended up completing the marriage and divorcing, and it really set me forth on a lifelong mission to understand the nature of sexuality and sexual expression and desire. And I really sort of explored that at the time. And up until about 12, 15 years ago, I was a graphic designer and art director. I had my own branding studio. And and was sort of, this was just sort of a personal pursuit.
Mm.
But then I started to really step into it professionally, and got some formal training and a lot of practice, and ended up leaving art direction and moving full time into sex and intimacy coaching.
Wow. A journey. That's quite the journey.
Yeah.
And you mentioned chapter one, which actually I have chapter one open and I had highlighted something that really spoke to me that I've heard so many of my friends talk about, um, and just other relationships in my circle. And I feel like we can all really relate to this. If you'll indulge me, I just wanted to read a couple of sentences. So this is on page 10. I was still left wondering how a healthy, educated, self aware young woman who loved her husband had inexplicably lost her sex drive. That I had no one to turn to, no one who could help me understand what I was experiencing, set me on a lifelong path and purpose of exploring and discovering the true nature of sexuality, which is what you just described to us. But
Yeah.
I think I think what I'm wondering is, as you started to really dive into this, did you learn any, did you unlearn any myths? Did you find any like answers where you had aha moments and figured out, oh, well, that's where I went wrong, and perhaps the marriage could have been saved, or maybe that wasn't the path for you and you realized, okay, so this was the right decision for us. And I realized that is a multitude of questions. So I will stop talking and let you take it where you want to go.
um, yeah, I mean, I think there's really there's no one answer here, and I don't really know if the marriage could have been saved. I feel like it was a beautiful marriage. We had an amazing 10 years together, and what I really discovered was that I'm in marrying Vic, my husband. I married my mother. Like
Mm,
there was sort of an aspect of the way that he loved, gave and received love, and what love looked like with him, that was very familiar. They were different people completely, like personality. You would never, if you held the two of them together, you would never say, oh my God, these two people are so similar. It wasn't that at all. But there was a sort of like a vibrational frequency, and sort of conditions um, of of love, of being engaged in a loving relationship, that were very familiar and identical to what I was playing out with my relationship with my mother.
mm,
Um, I think in that sense, I had some healing to do. I had some healing and some growing and some individuation, and it wasn't going to happen with Vic. And the way in which I showed up inside that relationship was not sexy. It wasn't what I needed. I was sort of playing out the dynamic of my sort of childhood,
mm.
and that's not a healthy, mature adult relationship. So I had work to do. And and although I don't really go into it in the book, and I don't even spend much time on it because it's not my work anymore. um he had some work to do as well, that he's done over the years, and we talk about it quite a bit. But I think that what happened is that I knew some immediate things that I really needed, in order to sort of come alive and to feel like a sexual being again,
Mm.
especially in relationship. And then there were revelations over the years. 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, I can then go, oh yeah, that is, I can sort of look back through that lens. And then when I started to meditate, and sort of learn what presence and mindfulness was, oh, I can apply that lens to that relationship and these other three relationships and kind of see what was going on from that point of view, or tantra, or, some of the other sexology, some of the other things that I've studied and practiced.
Yeah. There's so many different thoughts going through my head, so I'm going to try to focus on one at a time. Most recently, I watched it's a short series on Netflix called Unorthodox. I don't know if you've heard of this.
I've seen it twice.
Okay, so you'll recall the scene where Yankee is with I think she might be a stripper or prostitute, maybe both. And he is asking her, what do you like? What do you want? And it's not in it's in like a very open, honest, vulnerable way of him trying to understand, how do I be a better lover? How do I guess, create intimacy with my partner? How do I create a space where my partner feels sexy? What is she like? And he's trying to really learn. It seems to me, that's what I took from it.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to learn, how to woo his wife back. And I thought that was, and then the response of this other person he's asking is like, well, you go slow, right? You touch her face first, and it's slow and it's soft, and you might touch her neck, and it's very gentle. And again, I keep using the word slow. And then you move down, and you might touch her breast, and then there's this waiting, and there's this building of a sense of longing, and that is allowed to be there. And so I wonder if, in your experience in your work, if there's these roles that we play out, it seems like there's a dynamic where one partner might be in a rush and they're already turned on, right? And then the other partner might need that slow burn, they might need that romance. And it doesn't seem like there's always that convergence of, oh, we both want the slow burn. Oh, we both want to show up in the same way. It's like we have different needs in terms of what makes us feel sexy. Is that, do you think, a result of two people miscommunicating in general? Do you think it's a result of not being matched, maybe sexually? Is it a gender difference? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, there are a couple different things to say here. One is that we could all slow down. Every one of us could slow down. And let's just compare it to like eating a meal. You can wolf your food down, or you could savor every bite, right? So in general, I think that we focus way too much on sort of what we think of as, passionate sex, or but I think a lot of that is just sort of I want to say laziness almost. I mean, it's just sort of like a rush to a finish line. And I will often sort of suggest to a couple that I'm working with to take orgasm off the table and stop making orgasm the goal of sex. Not permanently. People get all crazy when I say that. Like I'm telling people to never have orgasms. That's not what I'm saying at all. But like as an experiment in the laboratory of pleasure and intimacy, see what happens when you decide that you're not going to have an orgasm, and that the entire goal of sex excuse me, the entire goal of sex is just creating like an unprecedented level of pleasure, right? And that extended state of arousal is really delicious. I mean, there's so much experience and sensation and energy to be had in that extended state of arousal that you talk about maybe one partner really needing that. We could all use that. Anticipation builds a passion and desire, and arousal, as a matter of fact. So I think that that's a worthwhile like paradigm shift for sex in general. The other thing that I want to mention is that it's really normal for people to have a couple different kinds of desire, or desire response, which is um, spontaneous desire and responsive desire. So spontaneous desire is someone who just spontaneously feels like they want to have sex. Like it's, they think of something, or they see somebody or something, or, they're just sort of like raring to go. And responsive desire is someone who actually needs to be engaged in sexual activity to start to feel desire. It's totally normal. And so you'll see this a lot in couples where one complains that the other one doesn't ever initiate. Well, some of that could be because they don't realize that they've got a responsive desire, that there's somebody who really needs to be engaged. They're not spontaneously going to say, oh, I really feel like having sex tonight. So there are ways to work with both. And there's sort of, you can be a combination. And some people go through phases where they're much more spontaneously desirous than others. And it could be situational, but for the most part, when you speak to people, there's a general sort of like, yeah, that sounds like me. I usually feel this way or the other way. So, yeah, I mean, I think that people who experience that are not mismatched. And I think that there's a lot of sort of meeting in the middle and experimenting that can go on, that can really be exciting.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on, I think this is personally for me, it took me a long time to figure out, and I still feel like I'm figuring out how to do this, to say what I need, to voice what I want, to voice what I like. And I don't know if that's like a cultural thing, if I feel like, I think this is in the realm of shame. And I know you can speak in depth about intimacy as the antidote to shame. So I'd like to dive into that topic and touch a little bit on like the fear of speaking up and saying what you want, but also that broader topic of intimacy being that antidote to shame.
Yeah. I think that we're, oh boy, it's a big topic, and it's big and deep and common, ubiquitous, really, that we're really not given a context in which it's okay to want sex, talk about sex, talk about what we need in bed and in life in general. We're very, I think there's just a lot of hesitance to feeling vulnerable, to speaking up. And a lot of us were taught to be pleasers and to put everybody else before us. And so there are a lot of different reasons and a lot of different sort of cultural narratives around self-advocacy, and particularly when it comes to pleasure and physical pleasure. I think there's a big stigma, with women knowing what they want, because it's sort of a admission that they have desire, that they have had sex, either with themselves or with another partner, or that they've experimented enough to even know what they want. It certainly doesn't speak to the sort of purity or innocence paradigm that is, required of women in many cultures. So yeah, listen, Brene Brown, the sort of leading expert on shame, she's so brilliant and articulate when it comes to shame. So she defines shame as the belief that we are so bad or broken that we are unworthy of love and belonging. Right. So if you take that into this idea that we may no longer be desirable, that it would be bad, or we would be broken, or somebody would, not want us anymore, that we would not belong anymore. or love us if we somehow revealed to them that we were sexual, that's a really, really vulnerable place to be. So what I usually talk to people about is to choose wisely, right? Choose your partners that don't expect you to be something that you're not, and so assuming that that's the case, have some of these conversations outside the bedroom, like there are ways of talking about some of these intimate topics where when you're not in the middle of the act, right? So there's less vulnerability just situationally. The other thing is that when you are in bed, there are ways of speaking and making requests and asking for what you want in a way that is sexy, that is, alluring and erotic. It doesn't necessarily need to be like, you switch into teacher mode and teach your lover how to touch you, like there are ways of, and showing is always a good one. That's a lot of people are very shy about touching themselves in front of a partner, but it's really can be such a beautiful and loving and erotic way to show somebody the way you like to be touched, is by showing them how you do it yourself.
Yeah, it's such a nice invitation. Zoe, I wanted to go back to something we talked about prior to this conversation before I forget it. And that is so you used your personal example of leaving Vic and moving on and going through this whole journey of self-discovery, learning about yourself. And I wonder, for those of us that if we're in that situation, we're thinking about leaving a partner, or maybe we're ready to find a new partner, how do we not fall into that same kind of, because I think it's so normal, right? That we choose partners that have something to teach us, number one, they always do, and that are very closely modeled after our parental figures. How do we break that cycle? In a nutshell, I mean, I know we're not gonna, I know that's a big question.
Well, I went from Vic to my next partner being completely the opposite. Like,
Okay.
there was a certain dynamic and a certain level of like enmeshment and codependency that I ended up with somebody who was completely not in touch with their emotions. So I went from somebody who was like, the whole dynamic was about their feelings, to someone who was just the opposite. I didn't have to take care of him emotionally, but that's because he was so cut off from his emotions that they weren't really there in the space. I mean, they were, the sort of the punchline is that they are there in the space and he's not dealing with them. And so I just had to deal with them in a different way. But, I can't emphasize enough the the part of the book that I call, being with yourself, intimacy with self. I think that no matter what relationship you're in, if you're in a relationship, if you're not in a relationship, there's an ongoing relationship with yourself, an intimate relationship that can be cultivated and should be cultivated. And the more you know yourself, the more you will be able to meet someone else skillfully.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And getting to know yourself is such a lifelong journey and practice. I mean, I think about different tools that we have to get to know ourselves. You mentioned one, meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other tools, practices that you found were really helpful?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, everybody has a little bit of a different pathway in, there's psychotherapy, there's yoga, there's meditation, there are workshops, there's reading books and podcasts, and all kinds of different spiritual paths. I think that the way that I have over the years, radical intimacy is the title of the book, but it's actually the sort of model of intimacy that I've been coaching and developing organically over the past decade or so. And that is, I talk about three different kinds of intimacy: emotional, physical, and what I call energetic.
Mm-hmm.
And the three levels of intimacy, which is self, other, and world. So when you take the self, intimacy with self, and you look at emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, and energetic intimacy, those are three realms that you can really intentionally develop with yourself and deepen your connection with yourself. So when you're looking at, emotional intimacy, knowing two things, like knowing cognitively the complexity and the nuances of your emotional landscape. Like, I'm not just angry, but I'm angry because I feel violated, or I feel rejected, or I feel a fear of abandonment, or there are many different flavors of that anger. I feel outrage, or I feel there is such a I put in the book a wheel of emotion, which you can also find by Googling. The one I put in the book, I've sort of optimized for accuracy. And I think some of the ones online are not as well put together.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding the nature of emotion in general, and then being willing to feel your emotions. I mean, that's part of all of this. Is, I also talk about the trifecta of anti-intimacy, which is denial, deflection, and distraction. And those are things that we put in place. They're coping mechanisms for avoiding the discomfort of difficult emotions. And the fact is that if we're going to be intimate with ourselves, we have to be able to feel and experience and be honest with ourselves about the uncomfortable feelings that we're having, things that we have been told or that we deem to be negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it, physical intimacy with ourselves. Like, do you know where your pancreas is and what it does in your body?
I probably couldn't tell you with any level of scientific detail.
Most people have no idea what's happening in their bodies,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, truly. And then there's, self-pleasure when it comes to our sexuality and our sexual response and organs. And so there's a lot there. And I do put exercises in the book about, different practices, different exercises to cultivate that kind of connection.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch on this one statistic you offer, which is related to our technology, basically. And that is heavy mobile device use also gets in the way of intimacy. You say both directly and indirectly. One study shows 20% of people ages 18 to 34 admit to checking their phones during sex.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and I mean, I'm sure there's a whole host of other things in terms of just like being in the presence of others. You could take sex out of it, like sitting at a dinner table. I could look around at a restaurant, and is anyone engaged in an eye contact conversation? Or most often, people are all on their phones, right?
Yeah.
So, what does that do to our ability to communicate, to know ourselves, and to be intimate, even in just a social setting?
Yeah. I'm a big, technology and cell phones can also be connective, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can have all kinds of intimacy with someone through text that that's a new pathway to connection. So I'm not anti-phone use, but like everything else, there certainly needs to be a balance. I mean, I certainly, unless somebody's on their deathbed, I would highly suggest not checking your phone during sex.
Yeah. Good suggestion.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so you spoke to this, but I want to dive into it a little bit more, that we can't be selectively intimate and experience only the pleasant parts. So the idea that you're either in or you're out in kind of an awkward situation, maybe something comes up in the act or after the fact, something needs to be talked about. How do we deal with those experiences in the moment? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I think that when something needs to be talked about, when there's an elephant in the room, or whether it's something that you are both aware of that no one's talking about, that sort of needs to be acknowledged, or even if you just have something that you need to talk through. I think just acknowledging that it's awkward is the first step. Like, I need to talk about this. I really want to talk about this, and I feel really nervous about it, or I feel awkward about it, or but I'm willing to be, in the sort of messiness of what it is. Yeah, I mean, who is it? It might be Tim Ferriss, who said that the success of a person can be measured by the number of difficult conversations they've been willing to have.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Tim Ferriss.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
I haven't heard that one though. Thank you for
I hope
that.
I'm attributing it correctly.
Well, either way, it's a good point to bring up because I think I feel like he talks about that in relationship to like when he was going out and figuring out how to fail or learn how to be rejected.
Yeah.
I do recall something along those lines because that, in terms of intimacy, I feel like when you talk about vulnerability and learning how to know yourself and learning how to ask for what you want, what a valuable skill or a valuable tool or a valuable practice, however you want to put it, to develop is kind of, I don't know if overcoming is the right word, but facing the fear of rejection. And it's that stoic philosophy of practicing the thing which you fear the most, and see if you survive, see what happens, like
Yeah.
what's the worst possible thing that could happen, and recognize that you're going to be okay
Yeah.
in most situations, right?
I think the thing is that, like, I often find myself reassuring people that none of us know what the hell we're doing,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
we think that we should be, we put this pressure on ourselves to that we should know what we're doing, or that it should not be uncomfortable, or that we shouldn't be disoriented, or we shouldn't be, feel awkward. And the thing is that that's just part of being human. And if we could just sort of give ourselves permission to show up and say, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I feel like I got to talk about something,
Yeah.
that's more than half the battle.
Yeah. And what a gift to give yourself, a gift of freedom and just kind of taking the weight off your shoulders.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about well, there's a couple things. First is the idea of the honeymoon phase in a new relationship, and whether that's a stereotype that is or isn't true or has truth to it. How do we navigate past that? How do we keep, the flame alive, as it were? And then the second topic, I'm going to say it out loud so I don't forget to come back to it, is personally, I've been thinking a lot about perimenopause and menopause lately in terms of hormones changing and what that does to sex drive. So those are two topics I want to touch on with you.
I'm making
What?
a note.
Oh, okay. And just to give you a little bit more time, if either one of those grabs you right away and you want to take off, this doesn't have to be in a linear order. So feel free to choose
Okay.
which you like first.
I would love to talk about honeymoon first. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something when we first meet somebody that's, it's exciting. There's, there's like a period of discovery. Things are new. It's we get to sort of step into this sort of delicious magical phase where we we see ourselves through the reflection of, a very curious partner. Like it's lovely when our partner feels curious about us, and curiosity is something that I like to sort of a thread I like to pull through a long-term monogamous relationship. So I think that, again, I'm a Zen Buddhist practitioner, so I'm very big on seeing things as they really are. Just sort of accepting what is. And so it's great to acknowledge the excitement of a new relationship, and it's also necessary, in a healthy, skillful way, to acknowledge when that excitement sort of dissipates and something else grows. There's a certain sort of intoxication at first that can happen, and it feels really good. And given who we are, culturally at this time on the planet, I don't know that this was always the case, but this sort of immediate gratification and sort of intoxication and desire to sort of escape reality, I think that, to sort of make that the pinnacle of relationship, of romantic relationship, is really a mistake. And it's too bad. It's a missed opportunity, because over time, what replaces that intoxication is a deep, nourishing, loving, sustainable partnership. And I think that there's plenty of passion and intimacy that can be cultivated over time. It's like, again, with food analogy, there's like, you can have a bite of some outrageously delicious chocolate cake, or you could have, like, a long, slow, delicious 8-course meal. And so, I think keeping the flame alive, maybe there are ways in which you work to cultivate a bonfire occasionally in year 12 or 15 of the marriage, but there's also a real benefit to being able to, like, keep some embers burning, and have a slow roast.
Slow roast. And all of these food analogies are making me hungry. Chocolate cake, 8-course meal.
Yeah.
Bonfire, some s'mores. I love it. Yes, I 100% agree. It seems to me like there's kind of an ebb and flow to it. Like there's a season, and I'm not sure if it's celestial, if it has something to do with the moon, or the waxing and waning of that, or just kind of the seasons we go through as human beings in partnership over a long period of time. But it does seem like, at least in my experience, that there will be weeks or sometimes months where we're kind of like two ships passing in the night, and then we will reconnect and rekindle that flame. So I guess I say that to just call out that because you're having a couple of off weeks or an off month doesn't mean that all is lost. Like it will, that too shall pass.
For sure.
So what are your thoughts on hormones, and in terms of like women's sexuality as we come to that age where, we pass into menopause, in terms of sexuality?
Yeah, I think that, hormones and age and is one thing. I also will sort of, what I'm about to say also goes for medications that can affect sex drive, and SSRIs and other, there are a whole lot of pharmaceuticals that are worth taking for certain people. that can have an effect on sex drive. And so, I think that a lot of what we can do, we can find power in that situation when our body doesn't respond the way we expect it to or the way it used to. I think really sort of, again, meeting ourselves where we are or acknowledging what is right now is really powerful. So, we can tend to, again, like if the relational sex isn't as, hot or as, passionate, and we're sort of, not feeling that insatiable desire for each other, there that's okay. There are other things that are brewing that are just as nourishing or more nourishing and more sustainable over time. The same thing is true individually. So, if you are slower to orgasm or not lubricating as much as you used to, we have technology, we have lube, we have toys, we have um, coconut oil, we have all kinds of things, that might be just fine. It doesn't mean we're broken. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. It just means our body's in a different phase and needs different things.
Mm.
I think it's always called for, if you're really suffering inside of this paradigm, to speak to your medical team and see if there's anything, a different medication or anything that can help. But I also think that a good dose of compassion and self-love and acceptance can go a long way.
Yeah, I love that. Thank
I'll
you.
tell you, I'm 58. I hit menopause really late, only in the last couple years.
Mhm.
But I have a lot of friends who are in their 50s, women who are in their 50s. Many of them are having just the opposite experience that you would think. Many of them are suffering with painful intercourse and vaginal atrophy and a lot of the things that you hear about. But a whole handful of them have like a new freedom. They just feel so free in their bodies and very sexual. And so it there's a mixed bag.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think that's an important reminder not to write ourselves off because we think we're going through this period of time where in general we're told that our vagina is going to shrivel up and close off and cobwebs are going to grow. The whole scary story. But that's heartening to hear. And in my friend circle, I'm almost 40, so most of my friends are around the 40 age mark. And what I'm seeing, which I was surprised by, is that many of us are in perimenopause, which feels young to me. I thought so alarm bells went off. I started to freak out, and then I would talk to my friends and we'd freak out together. And so that's kind of the impetus of this question is what am I looking forward to and should I be worried? And so thank you for addressing that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to be mindful of your time, but I want to know, so this book, Radical Intimacy, Cultivate the Deeply Connected Relationships You Desire and Deserve, came out April 12th. So it's been out for a little bit, and I can just imagine, well, actually, this is a mixed bag too. I hear a lot of authors talk about, oh, well, it just kind of flowed out of me. I was writing it before I even actually wrote it. And then a lot of authors talk about the labor of love, how it was a job, how you showed up at your desk every day and you carved out the time. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your writing process.
Um, I fall into the earlier category. I just, um, I love to write, if I did nothing for the rest of my life but write books, I'd be thrilled. um, so yeah, I mean, it was really, I felt very much like it was an opportunity to put on paper everything that I've been saying and talking about and practicing for a decade. It really did flow out of me for the most part. I had a great editor who I loved, Renee Sedlier at Hachette Go. And she shared my vision and just was like the perfect mirror for
Mm.
me. I'd turn in, I gave her, I think 3 chapters at a time,
Mhm.
write about that. And then she would take a week and get back to me. And for the most part, it was super smooth. I was an editorial writer. I'm the former senior editor of LA Yoga Magazine, and I've written a ton of articles. And so I write to word count. I know how to write to word count, and it helps